Joan Hawkins is a professor of cinema and media studies at IU. In her creative life, she has published creative memoir pieces and poetry. She most enjoys spoken word performances and often collaborates with musicians. She's the chair of the Writers Guild at Bloomington. Joan Hawkins.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. And in keeping with the kind of tendency of the Writers Guild stage, Writers Guild spoken word stage, this is going to be a kind of a shift in tone. So I have two pieces. One is a kind of, I'm going to start with kind of the heavier piece, and then do the comic piece afterwards. So, trigger warning. This first piece deals with sexual assault. I am omitting the actual description of the assault, and I've softened the language. I don't see anybody here with kids, but I didn't want people having to explain the R word to a 6-year-old. So this is called Philosophy Lessons. This is a true story. The night Paul Thurman assaulted my best friend, he gave me a ride home. Or to be more precise, he gave me a ride to my mother's. It was so late the electric trolley cars had stopped running, so my plan was to walk to my mom's apartment a few blocks away and spend the night there. Paul thought I was crazy. "You can stay here," he said. "Sleep on the couch." But I wanted to leave. You see, Paul, Dr. Thurman, was the chair of the philosophy department at the state college I attended. And the thought of waking up on his couch, no toothbrush, funky clothes, the social obligation to make small talk over morning coffee, was mortifying. The evening had been strange enough. The morning after would be downright freaky. I'd come with a group of philosophy students who'd worked all evening compiling the department's fall course descriptions. Holed up in Dr. Thurman's office, typing, mimeographing, collating, stapling, we'd been told he wouldn't be there. And early in the evening, it looked like he would leave, but then he didn't. And at the end of the work session, he offered us drinks and pizza at his place, a way of saying thank you, he said. So we piled into a couple of VW buses and drove to Paul's. There were 6 of us, Meredith, me, and 4 graduate students, all men. At Thurman's, the wine and vodka flowed free. The drinks were very strong. And that pizza we were supposed to be ordering never quite got dialed in. Meredith got into an argument with some graduate student over Heidegger. The grad student was defending him, and Meredith was livid. "He was a Nazi," she kept saying. In another corner, another grad student, this one with a tiny goatee and a passion for Kant, was holding forth on the sublime. I retreated to the hearth, poking the ashes and feeding the fire. I tried taking a few small sips from my drink to keep it from spilling over, but even those were too strong. So I set the glass aside and waited for Meredith to finish her quarrel so we could leave. All the while, Paul Thurman stayed in the background. Once he'd written a brilliant essay about the pre-Socratic notion of constancy applied to the odds of winning in Vegas. And now, leaning against the bookcase, he waited and watched to see which way the chips and the ladies would fall. As I said, Meredith and me were the only 2 ladies present, and looking back now, I'm amazed I didn't recognize the track. No food, strong drinks, hot apartment. And then that moment when Paul peeled himself loose from the bookcase, took Meredith and me by the elbow, and led us out to see his midnight balcony garden. When we came back inside, the grad students had left. That's when I went in the other room and called my mother, who offered to pick us up, but I wanted to walk, and I thought the air would help us both, Meredith and me. But that last drink had hit Meredith hard. By the time I came back to the living room, she was stretched out on the sofa, a room spinning around her, and she had already accepted Paul's invitation to spend the night. "Are you sure?" I asked, just often enough to annoy her. "You can come with me, my mom won't mind." "Positive," she said. By the time I started collecting my things, she was already asleep, or perhaps passed out, the firelight flickering across her face, casting gothic shadows, a burnt-out cigarette stub still in her hand. Thinking about the hangover she was sure to have, I tried one last time to wake her, but she was out cold, and only shivered a little when I shook her shoulder. I remember Paul looking very fatherly as he told me it was better for her to stay there. She's too drunk to walk, he said, and I don't think I can carry her. It's all right. She's stayed here before. Other students have stayed here. Whistling a little, he went in the hall and came back with a pastel armful of blankets. Together we covered Meredith with a small pink and green quilt. Meredith was taller than me, but she looked tiny under the blanket, and I wondered why she'd never told me that she and Thurman were friends. We weren't, she told me later. We aren't. As for him, he'd always been so derisive of the Marxist students. Hard to imagine philosophy sleepovers at his place, feminists talking dialectical materialism with the department chair until the last streetcar had gone. But perhaps his wife would have taken an interest. He used to have a wife. Are you sure you don't want to stay? Paula asked me. I have plenty of blankets. Positive, I answered. Well, at least finish your drink, he said, holding out the glass I'd abandoned earlier. No thanks, I said, shaking my head. What I wanted at the moment was some fresh air, some food, and a cup of my mother's hot cocoa. I knew she'd be waiting up for me, curious to know why I hadn't gone home. Well, let me give you a ride, Paul said. The neighborhood isn't safe. We didn't talk much in the car. Chilly night, big day tomorrow. A volley of little phrases, just enough to take the edge off the silence. When we got to my mom's, Paul double parked and waited, but when I opened the door, he leaned over, grabbed my arm, and said, I just want you to know, I wish you'd been the one who stayed. Then with a little shove, he pushed me out and drove off, leaving me standing in the street thinking of every weird thing he'd ever said. That beginning of the term party I did not attend. Meredith told me later he'd asked about me and seemed disappointed when she told him I'd gone to visit my boyfriend. Oh, he reportedly said, she has a boyfriend. And that time Meredith and I stood in the hallway asking Dr. Silverman if we could write a collaborative paper. Hey, Jim, Paul, Dr. Thurman called as he walked past, two of his own students in tow. How come you get the pretty ones? And tonight when he stood behind my chairs, I tapped his course description and leaning just a little too close, had asked about the perfume I was wearing. It suits you, he said. My ankle throbbed. Maybe I'd twisted it when he pushed me out of the car, and I limped as I walked toward the sidewalk. When I got to the curb, I vomited. My mother didn't think Meredith was in any danger. In her world, bosses didn't have to physically force themselves on women. It was the truck drivers and your fellow workers with their sidelong glances, sweaty muscled arms, and quick hands that you had to be careful of. Bosses just called you into the office, cut your hours, split your shift, moved you to a team where the work was harder and more dangerous, unless... Mom had frequently changed jobs because of her bosses, but she'd never had to fight one off with a dispatch rep. He's the chair of the philosophy department, she told me. He's not going to molest a girl who's passed out on his couch. And it doesn't sound like he's interested in her, but you'd better be careful, because you could find yourself in a bad situation. It was the one time I listened to my mother and wish I hadn't. The one time Mom was wrong. I didn't see Meredith in class the following morning, but she did meet me for lunch at the Mexican restaurant where we always ate. Big enchilada platters and a salad for $3, free Coke, mangoes when they were in season, perfect for construction workers and impoverished students. Meredith was sitting at a corner table away from the windows. She was wearing a black turtleneck sweater and jeans, clothes I had never seen her wear before. No jewelry, no makeup. Very pale, with only her dark hair and sweater standing out against the white and blue walls. She ordered a bowl of soup, which she didn't eat, and a cup of black coffee. When she turned her head, I noticed that her lip was swollen and her cheek was bruised. What happened? I asked, whispery as though we were sharing secrets in class, and so she tells me. After he finished, he got up, handed her a tissue, and went into the bedroom. She waited, maybe 20 minutes, she guessed, because she heard the entire first side of Rubber Soul playing through the wall. When the apartment was finally quiet, she got dressed and walked home. She was still bleeding. Pointing to my own cheek, I asked if he had hit her. No, she said. She had fallen on the way home a couple of times. And no, she did not want to go to the clinic. And she did not want to file a police report. Are you kidding? She said. He's the chair of the philosophy department. I'm a hippie chick with an active sex life, and I was drunk. They'd rake me over the coals. I didn't ask about filing a complaint with the school. There was no institutional way to file such a complaint back then. No disciplinary action that could be taken as far as any of us knew. Women who had bad experiences wrote abbreviated tales on the bathroom walls, warning others. I imagined Meredith would leave such a warning about Paul, in her signature green ink, letters tilting a little to the right. If Thurman invites you to his place, don't go, she'd write, even with friends, speaking from experience. A week later, she left school. Where's Meredith, Dr. Silverman asked me. Is she ill? Yes, I said, thinking of Aristotle's sickness of the soul. I don't know when she'll be back. It was a year before I saw Meredith again. She was moving from Los Angeles to Ukiah, and she stopped to spend the night. She was bright and jittery, all jangling bangle bracelets and beads, full of stories and plans that didn't quite make sense. My brother came by to deliver some chairs and stayed for dinner. We spent a mad evening, Meredith drinking brandy and telling my ultra-conservative brother that she wanted to go work with the Tupamara gorillas in Uruguay. He thought she meant gorillas and kept asking, like Jane Goodall? I thought you studied philosophy. Laughing and never answering his question, Meredith kept repeating, Tupamara gorillas, in syncopated time, as she reached for the brandy bottle. She passed out that night, too. My husband carried her to the sofa, and we tried to make her comfortable with a pillow and a small blue quilt. Looking down at her, I shivered as the memory of that awful night reached out its withered hand. She cut out early the next morning before anyone else was up. Left an effusive thank you note on the kitchen table. She'd made coffee, she said, and nabbed a bagel. She'd call when she got settled. I never heard from her again. I tried contacting her parents, but they'd moved and there were thousands of Brennans. In recent years, I've tried searching for her online, Google, Facebook, Instagram. I even tried one of those we can find anyone services. No luck. And so we have never had that conversation. You left me there. You wouldn't come with me. The conversation I thought might mend our friendship. About 10 years after Meredith's assault, I saw Jim Silverman at a reading. He told me Meredith's father had called him, had said Meredith was disturbed and a pathological liar. He wanted Jim's help in having her involuntarily committed. Jim had refused. And no, sorry, he didn't get a contact number. A few days later, I ran into Paul Thurman at Top Dog, Berkeley's anarcho-libertarian sausage place. Cramped and greasy with newspaper clippings, Emma Goldman quotes, and poetry scotch taped to the walls, it was an odd place to encounter a pre-Socratic philosophy don and molester. He was seated at the counter with his back to the door, so I didn't notice him at first, and he did not see me. But when I gave the barman my order, he, this leather-jacketed man at the counter, sat up very straight and turned. Paul Thurman. A little heavier, a little older, shorter hair, but definitely Paul Thurman. I'd know that voice anywhere, he said, extending his hand. Warm, high school reunion smile, just like we were two old friends bumping into each other after a lifetime spent apart. In my mind's eye, I saw Meredith, sitting cross-legged on her living room floor, shuffling tarot cards, fanning them out, selecting 3. Afterward, she threw the I Ching. I'm leaving, she told me. What do you say to the man who ruined your friend's life? The man who had wanted to ruin yours. At Top Dog, an ancient black and white TV set perched precariously over the grill played noontime reruns of the old Perry Mason show. I told Jake, the grill master, that I wanted my order to go. cutting, narrowed eyes at Paul, he nodded. I was one of his best customers, and he didn't know this man from Adam, but he'd certainly picked up the vibe. Some jerk driving our regulars away, I could hear him telling his partner, and I had a feeling I'd get a free coffee next time around. I paid for my sausage and my drink, got some Russian mustard from the bar, onions, peppers, napkins, all the while Paul sitting there looking at me. Silence spreading out between us. What do you say to the man who ruined your friend's life? The man who had wanted to ruin yours. I loved that show as a kid, I finally said, jerking my head toward the TV. Assholes always confessed, and they always paid. Too bad life isn't like that. Passive-aggressive, I know. But direct confrontation would have meant saying Meredith's name, hearing excuses and denials, and I thought she wanted to. I thought that's why she stayed. Or even worse, I don't remember. Listening to his side of the story, and I could not bear that. By this time, Jake and the two other people at the counter were staring at us. I stuffed some money in the tip jar, nodded to Jake, and walked out. What do you say to the man who ruined your friend's life? Not much, as it turns out. You just tell her story and say a few cryptic words to your fellow travelers at the lunch counter. Thanks. So that story was written for a volume of short pieces that a number of women from the Writers Guild have been putting together called Trigger Warnings. And we're hoping that it will come out later this year. So to not leave you on such a heavy note, and I hope that man has gotten some kind of appalling, hideous disease sometime in his life to make up for all of it. So this is a much more humorous thing. This is called A Middle-Aged Woman Alone Tries to Buy a Bottle of Wine in North Dakota, or The Corkscrew. This is another true story. It was the corkscrew that set them off. Of course, they already had their suspicions, which began, I believe, when I arrived at the gas station liquor store on foot and asked if they sold wine. They did. But as I said, they had their suspicions. And I know this because the cigar-chomping man behind the cash register sent one of his teenage employees to follow me, just to be sure I found the wine section. But even after I did find the wine, the kid sort of hovered. Oh, he pretended to be occupied, restacking already perfectly stacked cases of beer and polishing the vodka bottles with an enthusiasm that seemed completely out of keeping with the situation. Once, when I became visibly annoyed, he did a graceful pirouette that landed him in the scotch section. But soon he was back with his orange rag, restacking 12 packs of PBR and wiping down the Smirnoff bottles with gusto. Hovering. Now why, you might wonder, was I looking for wine in a gas station liquor store? It's a reasonable question. I was, you see, in Hettinger, North Dakota, where you could only buy liquor of any stripe in a state liquor store, which in Hettinger was either in the bar or at the gas station. And I wanted wine, well, because I like wine, but also because beer doesn't really relax me in the same way. And I did not want spirits because I planned to drink several glasses, and I did not want to get totally wasted. Just a little buzz. Just a little relaxation. And I certainly didn't want to go to the bar to buy a bottle to go because, well, I was already arousing suspicion in the gas station, a woman alone and all. I think if I had been 21, they would not have been suspicious, just pegged me for a wild girl off to a party, but I was in my 40s. No man in tow that they could see, and no car. So what was I doing on foot in a gas station trying to buy anything stronger than a can of Pepsi? Well, I'll tell you. See, my mother had had a stroke. Now, what she was doing in Hettinger is its own story and merits its own little piece, but she had had a stroke and was in a nursing home, too frail to move to Indiana. She existed in a kind of twilight zone, between whimsical, happy fantasies in which she thought she was on a cruise ship in Alaska, and nightmares in which the staff she relied on whisked people away in the dead of night for unspeakable surgeries. She heard demonic voices through the heating vents, she said. She was frequently ill with infections, and I found myself making many trips to manage hospital care. Now, it was during one of those visits when I thought I'd lost her, called for a priest, called my brother, called school to say I wouldn't be coming back as planned, and then miraculously she recovered. It was during one of those visits when we were packing our suitcases to go home that my husband had a massive hemorrhage, passed out in the bathroom, blood everywhere. I called an ambulance to take us the 2 blocks to the hospital and spent another tortured night and 2 more days sitting beside someone I loved. When I wandered into the gas station that night, Skip had just spent his second night out of ER. My mother was safely back in the nursing home, and I was planning to go back to my room at the Mirror Lake Lodge, watch David Letterman, drink some wine, and pack, this time for real, to take my beloved Skip home to his own doctor. I had not had a full night's sleep for 2 days, or taken a shower, hadn't eaten much and was jagged out from caffeine, and I'd used up all my patience talking to medical staff about my family and triangulating with my brother. So all I wanted to do was select a bottle of wine in peace, maybe buy a can of nuts and some breath mints, and now this child was hovering. I found a bottle of Beringer Cabernet, grabbed it, and turned around so abruptly that I scared the hovering child back into the scotch section. Got my Planters peanuts, my Altoids, and then spreading everything out on the counter, I asked to buy a corkscrew. "You don't have a corkscrew?" the proprietor asked, with one of those looks that said, no matter what you say now, it will be the wrong answer. Well, as a matter of fact, I did have a corkscrew, but it was attached to my husband's Swiss Army knife, and I did not want to go back to the hospital after hours to rifle through Skip's jeans. So, no, I said, I don't. "May I see your ID, please?" Now, this was the time before our current moment when everyone who looks younger than 90 is carded. This was back in the day when if you looked 40, and I did, you got a pass. So while I did give him my Indiana State ID card, I did not do so graciously, but sort of smacked it down onto the counter. He took it and disappeared into the back. Now, I found out later that there had been a series of gas station convenience store robberies in the area, and that the burglars always sent an unaccompanied woman into the store to case the joint a day or so before making their hit. I never found out if my double looked anything like me, but the clerk was worried that I was part of some out-of-state gang. As I said, he told me all this later. At this point in my story, he came back out front, no corkscrew in hand, asking for a second ID. Well, now my state ID lists my eyes as blue, but they are actually blue-green. That is blue with a green ring around the iris that expands and contracts. My husband swore he could read my mood by looking in my eyes and seeing how much green was showing. He said that when I was angry, my eyes turned completely jade. I could feel them turning jade now. And I'm not entirely sure what would have happened if my uncle, my mother's youngest brother, the one who adored her, hadn't picked that precise moment to come in and pay for a tank of gas. He took it all in a second. The items spread out on the counter, the proprietor with my ID in his hand, and me looking, as he put it later, madder than a wet hen. "Samuel, what in the world is the matter with you?" he asked. "This is Teresa's daughter." Samuel looked shocked, muttered something about not knowing, and tried to apologize, but my Uncle Joe was having none of it. Where the H had Samuel been? Hadn't he heard the news? Teresa's daughter came from Indiana to take care of her mother, and then her husband got sick. Everyone in town had seen her walking back and forth between the hospital and the nursing home. Shorty from the gift store had even made a trek up to the hospital to bring her some decent coffee and that special roast beef sandwich she liked just to get her to eat something. And you know Shorty has a bad hip. Heck, that news had circulated all the way through the farm report. There had been 3 prayer chains. 3 prayer chains, Joe thundered. Even the Lutherans were praying, and they never pray for Catholics. By this time, Samuel was hanging his head looking like an altar boy caught dipping into the tabernacle wine. He made a second valiant attempt to apologize, but my uncle was on a roll, and it had just occurred to him that family honor was at stake. Besides, he said, look at her, look at her. She has the Wonder family written all over her. She definitely has the Wonder family temper that you were about to get a piece of. Now, what, you might wonder, was the hovering child doing during all this? Well, he was no longer hovering. He was frantically going through inventory in the back, thinking that if only I got my corkscrew, peace would be restored. And now, clearing his throat and squeezing past my uncle, he laid one on the counter. That took the wind out of my uncle's sails. He looked at it like it was a dead rat. And he was just starting to ask what in the world that was for when the Wonder humor got the better of the Wonder temper, and I started laughing. Then Samuel started laughing. Even Uncle Joe, who had missed the whole corkscrew part of the encounter, started laughing. As Samuel began ringing us both up, he told the story of the desperados with their female lookout. Joe left to start circulating that news, and Samuel gave me my change. I'm sorry about the mix-up, he said. And your uncle's right, I should have known you right off. You do favor your mother, and you definitely have her